The rights of victims of domestic violence, vulnerable persons, and their defenders under the constitutional framework of Pacifica. A Victims and Protectors Bill of Rights grounded in sovereignty, non-aggression, and the duty to intervene. Introduction: domestic violence, vulnerability, and the constitutional duty to defend. Domestic violence is not merely an interpersonal harm. It is not simply a criminal offense, a family dispute, or a matter of private misconduct. At its core, domestic violence is a systematic assault on human sovereignty, carried out through domination, coercion, fear, dependency, and control. It thrives most effectively where vulnerability exists and persists most reliably where institutions decline to intervene. Any constitutional order that claims to protect liberty must therefore confront domestic violence not as a marginal social problem, but as a direct constitutional concern. A society that tolerates domination in the intimate sphere cannot meaningfully claim to prohibit it in the public one. The constitutional framework of Pacifica represents a decisive break from conventional approaches. It treats domestic violence as a form of ongoing aggression, recognizes vulnerability as a condition that heightens rights rather than diminishes them, and affirms that defending a person subjected to coercive control is not interference, bias, or misconduct, but a protected and necessary act. This document articulates how Pacifica's constitutional principles together form an integrated Bill of Rights for victims of domestic violence, vulnerable persons, and those who defend them, while explaining the legal and moral logic that binds these protections into a coherent whole. Foundational premise: sovereignty is universal and non-conditional. Pacifica's constitutional order rests on a foundational axiom. Every natural person is sovereign by virtue of being human. Sovereignty does not depend on strength, independence, capacity, productivity, rational performance, social conformity, or institutional approval. It is not earned, granted, or revoked. It exists prior to the state and limits the state. This premise is especially critical in domestic violence contexts, where abusers routinely assert, implicitly or explicitly, that a victim's vulnerability negates their authority over their own life. Pacifica rejects this logic entirely. Vulnerability does not diminish sovereignty. It intensifies the constitutional obligation to protect it. A person does not lose the right to self-governance because they are disabled, traumatized, economically dependent, cognitively different, emotionally bonded, or socially isolated. To hold otherwise would convert need into forfeiture and care into control. Domestic violence reframed: exploitation of vulnerability as aggression. Vulnerability as the primary vector of abuse. Contemporary domestic violence research increasingly recognizes that abuse rarely begins with overt physical violence. Instead, it begins with the identification and exploitation of vulnerability. Such vulnerabilities may include, but are not limited to, disability or chronic illness, neurodivergence, trauma history, youth or advanced age, immigration or legal insecurity, economic dependence, caretaking responsibilities, social isolation or marginalization. Pacifica's constitutional framework implicitly recognizes this reality by defining aggression not merely as physical force, but as any act that exploits vulnerability to dominate another sovereign person. Domestic violence is therefore understood as the systematic exploitation of vulnerability to replace a person's self-governance with another's will. Under this understanding, abuse is not excused by claims of necessity, protection, concern, or love. Dependence does not confer authority. Assistance does not authorize domination. Care is not a license to control. 3. The rights of victims of domestic violence. The following articles articulate the core rights held by all victims of domestic and intimate partner violence under Pacifica's constitutional principles. These rights apply universally and operate with heightened force where vulnerability is present. Article 1. The right to personal security and bodily autonomy. Every victim has an absolute right to bodily integrity, health, and personal security. This right is non-waivable and non-transferable, regardless of relationship, dependency, or circumstance. It includes freedom from physical violence, sexual coercion, reproductive control, deprivation of sleep, food, medication, or medical care. Any act that uses caregiving, protection, or dependency as leverage over a person's body or physical well-being constitutes unconstitutional aggression. Article 2. The right to autonomy despite vulnerability. Victims retain full authority over their decisions, relationships, communications, movement, and consent. Pacifica explicitly rejects the doctrine, often embedded in institutional practice, that vulnerability licenses paternalism. Supported autonomy is not suspended autonomy. Assistance must be consensual. Control is impermissible. Article 3. The right to be free from coercive control and dependency exploitation. Pacifica recognizes coercive control as a distinct and serious constitutional harm. This includes, but is not limited to, monitoring communications or location, restricting access to money, transportation, or employment, destroying phones, documents, or assistive devices, threatening withdrawal of care or support, weaponizing diagnoses or disability, infantilizing or discrediting the victim's perception of harm. These acts are treated not as misunderstandings or emotional conflict, but as deliberate strategies of domination. Article 4. The right to heightened protection for vulnerable persons. Where vulnerability exists, the state's duty intensifies. Vulnerable persons have the right to proactive protection, early intervention, credibility without perfection, safety prioritized over procedural formalism. Pacifica rejects the notion that those least able to self-advocate must meet the highest evidentiary burdens. IV. The rights of those who defend victims of domestic violence. Domestic violence systems depend not only on controlling victims, but on isolating, discrediting, and punishing defenders. Pacifica directly confronts this dynamic. Article 5. The right to defend others from aggression. Every person has the constitutional right to defend another sovereign person from ongoing aggression, with that person's consent, or where consent is impossible due to coercion or incapacity. This includes the right to assist escape, provide shelter or resources, offer transportation or communication access, document abuse, intervene to interrupt coercive control. Defense of a victim is not interference. It is an extension of the non-aggression principle. Article 6. The right of defenders to protection from retaliation. Those who defend victims have the right to be free from retaliation, including legal harassment, institutional intimidation, smear campaigns legitimized by authority, charges or sanctions designed to silence advocacy. Retaliation against defenders is recognized as a second-order abuse and a constitutional violation in its own right. Article 7. The right to be free from enforced neutrality. Pacifica rejects enforced neutrality in the face of coercive domination. Institutions may not penalize defenders for taking sides, demand false equivalence, or treat intervention as misconduct. Neutrality that enables domination is itself a form of harm. V. State obligations toward victims and defenders. A. Accountability without immunity. Where state actors ignore credible reports, discredit vulnerable victims, punish defenders, or return individuals to known danger, such actions constitute constitutional violations. Public officials are personally accountable for harm facilitated through indifference, obstruction, or abuse of discretion. B. Transparency as protection. Victims and defenders have the right to clear explanations, access to records, and review of decisions affecting safety, subject to appropriate protective measures. Opacity is recognized as a risk multiplier for abuse. C. Compassion as a constitutional requirement. Governance in Pacifica is required to operate with care, empathy, and awareness of trauma and power asymmetry. Procedures that retraumatize victims or punish defenders violate constitutional duty. VI. What Pacifica explicitly rejects. Pacifica rejects criminalizing defenders for aiding escape, treating advocacy as bias, forced mediation with abusers, mutualization of abuse without symmetrical power, using capacity as a tool of silencing, elevating reputational or property interests over safety. Conclusion: a constitutional ethic of protection and defense. Pacifica's constitutional framework affirms a clear principle. Vulnerability increases rights. Defense is protected. Abuse is defined by domination. Institutions are accountable for harm they enable. A society is free only to the extent that it protects those most easily dominated, and those who stand with them. This is not charity. It is constitutional duty.